The cell doors at Folsom State Prison are still the originals from 1880. Solid iron. No air holes. And for 60 years, men lived behind them in darkness, in a space 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, in a prison that the state of California built using the labor of the very men it was locking inside. That is not a metaphor. They quarried the granite. They cut it from the hillside. They stacked it 30 feet high around the perimeter of the place they could not leave. And then they went back inside, and the door closed behind them. Most people know Folsom from one thing. Johnny Cash walked in on January 13, 1968, said hello, and made one of the greatest live albums in American music history. The story of that concert has been told so many times that it has become comfortable. A redeemed outlaw plays for forgotten men. Everyone goes home feeling something. What almost nobody tells you is what happened to the man whose song Cash performed that night, and what that story reveals about everything Folsom actually was and still is underneath the mythology. Because the real history of this place is not a story about music. It is a story about 93 men who were hanged behind these walls across 42 years, the last of them dying on a rope in 1937. It is a story about the Thanksgiving Day when 1,200 prisoners watching a movie decided they had nothing left to lose. It is a story about a wall that took 4 decades to build because nobody in the state government was in a hurry to spend the money, while the prisoners inside escaped in every creative way they could devise, including once by hijacking a locomotive and driving it through the gate at full speed. It is a story about an inmate songwriter who got the break of his lifetime, walked out of prison into the care of the most famous country singer in America, and was dead within 7 years in circumstances that ended Cash's prison advocacy forever. And underneath all of that, running through every decade from 1880 to the present, is the question that Folsom has never resolved, and that California has never resolved, and that the United States has never resolved. What is a prison actually for? That question does not have a comfortable answer. Folsom's history is what happens when you build an institution without one. On July 26, 1880, 44 men arrived at Folsom by train, transferred from San Quentin, and walked through gates that had no wall around them. The site was on the American River, about 20 miles northeast of Sacramento, on land that had been a gold rush mining camp called Stony Bar. The camp was gone, the granite was not. It pushed out of the hills in enormous slabs, and the state had decided that granite and river water were the 2 things a prison needed most, one to build with and one to generate power. The men who arrived on that July morning were going to provide the 3rd thing, labor. The California legislature had authorized a 2nd state prison back in 1858. It took 22 years to receive the first prisoner. That gap is not a bureaucratic footnote. It reflects something real about how the state thought about the people it was sending there. The urgency was in the authorization, not in the preparation. What happened to the men once they were inside was a secondary concern, managed with whatever budget remained after the walls were funded, which was usually not much. The first thing those 44 men encountered was a facility built around 2 cell blocks. A block held 166 cells, B block held 162. The cells measured 4 feet wide and 8 feet deep, secured with solid iron doors that had 6-inch eye slots cut into them at face height. There was no other opening between a man and the corridor, no window, no gap at the bottom. In summer, the cells were furnaces. In winter, they were cold boxes. Air holes were not drilled into the cell doors until the 1940s, which means the design of the original doors was considered adequate for 6 decades before anyone in authority decided that men needed to breathe more freely. Those doors are still in use today. You can see them on the prison tour. The site was chosen partly because a private businessman named Horatio Livermore needed free labor to build a dam on the American River. His arrangement with the state was transactional and straightforward. Livermore contributed 350 acres for the prison site, and in exchange, the state would provide convict workers to help with dam construction. This is the kind of detail that tends to get buried in official histories of Folsom because it complicates the story of an institution built for public safety and the rehabilitation of criminals. The prison was located where it was in part because someone outside government needed something built cheaply, and men serving sentences were the cheapest labor available. The dam was finished in 1893. The convicts who built it were still inside the prison. The arrangement had worked out well for everyone except them. What made Folsom genuinely remarkable in its first years, and this needs to be stated without irony, was that it was the first prison in the world to have electric lights. The hydroelectric powerhouse built on the American River began generating power in 1895, and Folsom's cell blocks, administrative buildings, and warden's residence were electrified before almost any civilian building in California. Sacramento, 20 miles away, was receiving electricity from the same plant. The technology that lit the cells was cutting edge. The cells themselves were unchanged from 1880, 4 feet by 8 feet, solid iron door, 6-inch slot. The most modern electrical infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere, deployed inside a design that had not been updated since the prison opened. The granite wall that people associate with Folsom today was not part of the original design. It was designed before 1910 by state architects Sellon and Hemmings. Construction began in 1909, and it was not finished until 1923. For the first 43 years of Folsom's operation, the prison had no perimeter wall. The 1905 biennial report of the State Board of Charities and Corrections addressed this with language that reads, behind its formal phrasing, as genuine frustration. The need for a wall had been obvious since the prison was established, the report stated, and the previous year's escapes had demonstrated it beyond dispute. The state kept approving the prison's budget. The wall kept not getting built. The escapes kept happening. Before the wall went up, the attempts ranged from straightforward runs into the surrounding hills to genuinely inventive operations. In 1903, 13 inmates armed with knives broke from a mess hall line, killed a guard, and fled. 6 were recaptured. 1 was killed. 6 were never seen again. In 1920, 3 prisoners hijacked the prison locomotive, a small train used to haul construction materials along a short rail line between the prison and the town of Folsom, overpowered the crew, accelerated to full speed, and drove it through a prison gate. 2 were caught. The 3rd escaped and was never found. The locomotive was recovered. The gate was repaired. The record does not note what security measures were subsequently changed, which suggests the answer may have been very few. Construction on the granite wall finally began in earnest in 1909 and was completed in 1923. The wall stands 30 feet high and is buried 15 feet into the ground. The granite was quarried from the hillside beside the prison by the inmates who would be enclosed by it. They cut the stone, shaped it, and handed it to the construction crews who stacked it into the barrier that would keep them from leaving. This fact appears in almost every historical account of Folsom, always with the same weight, because it earns that weight every time. The men who could not escape built the thing that would stop them from trying. California paid them nothing for this beyond their room and board, which consisted of the 4x8 cell, 2 meals a day, and the official designation as a person whose debt to society was being discharged through labor. The stone that was not used for the wall went into California's infrastructure. The foundation of the state capitol building in Sacramento contains Folsom granite. A significant portion of the gravel used in California's early road network came from the Folsom quarry. The prison was, for decades, one of the most productive stone-cutting operations in the state. The men who ran the machines and swung the hammers were compensated according to the legal framework of the era, which held that a prisoner's labor belonged to the state. Whether this arrangement produced better citizens was not a question the state formally studied. The question it consistently asked was whether the labor offset the cost of incarceration. Folsom's relationship with death began formally on December 13, 1895, when a man named Chin Han was hanged there. After 1891, California centralized its executions at state prisons, and Folsom and San Quentin split the work. Han had been convicted of murdering a cigar merchant named Li Gong, whose wife watched him die with their daughters beside her. Hain maintained his innocence. His defense was supported by witnesses, contradicted by the victim's wife, and, ultimately, unsuccessful. He was Folsom's first execution. His mugshot survives in the archive. Between his death and December 3, 1937, 92 more men followed him to the same gallows. The condemned row at Folsom held 13 cells, a number that may or may not have been intentional, though the arithmetic around executions in that area suggests someone was paying attention to it. 12 jurors and a judge equals 13. 13 steps to the scaffold, 13 knots on the noose. The cells were arranged so that as each man was taken to the gallows, the remaining prisoners rotated one position closer to the trapdoor. A man in the cell adjacent to the execution chamber could hear his neighbor die and knew that he was next. The executioners at Folsom soaked the Italian hemp rope for 24 hours before each hanging, then stretched it for several months to eliminate recoiling. The rope featured a submental knot placed at the back of the neck to ensure maximum damage to the vertebrae. The prison's records state that all 93 condemned men died of instantaneous broken necks. Whether this is accurate for all 93 is difficult to verify independently. On the night before his execution in 1912, a man named Edward Delahanty, Folsom's 27th hanging, ordered pies, cakes, chicken, and candy for his last meal. Fellow prisoners played guitars and banjos through the cell doors. Delahanty danced. Then he stopped, went quiet, refused to touch any of the food, and asked that it all be given to the musicians. His instructions were followed. In 1930, when Walter Burke and James Gregg, two of the men condemned for their roles in the 1927 Thanksgiving riot, were asked what they wanted for their last meal, Burke requested chicken croquettes, and Gregg asked for bacon and eggs. Their three condemned companions ordered sweet potatoes, baked squash, bread and butter, peach pie, homemade donuts, and coffee. The morning of the execution, all five were served cereal, fried eggs, fried potatoes, corn griddle cakes with maple syrup, peaches, hot muffins, buttered toast, and more coffee. The precision of these last meals is one of the stranger features of institutional record-keeping. The state documented what these men ate in their final hours with greater care than it documented what they ate in any other year of their incarceration. The 1927 Thanksgiving riot was the deadliest single event in Folsom's history, and it began not with a plan, but with a failure. A small group of prisoners had been working toward an escape. When the timing fell apart, frustration spread through a population that had been accumulating grievances for years. The afternoon of November 24th, with approximately 1,200 prisoners watching a film in the school building, what had been a quiet resentment became something else. The prisoners seized control of most of the prison interior and took 5 guards as hostages. Warden Court Smith, who had run Folsom since 1913, called Governor C.C. Young from a telephone inside the compound. Young called out the California National Guard. 10 companies of infantry, roughly 450 men, were mobilized from 5 cities. Colonel Wallace Mason of the 184th Infantry reached the prison while units were still assembling. His guardsmen were instructed not to fire until ordered. They stood in the cold with fixed bayonets through the night, watching, while peace officers on the other side of the barricade fired approximately 2,000 rounds into the building where the prisoners were held up. The National Guard fired nothing. By morning, the prisoners negotiated terms and returned to their cells. 14 people were dead, among them an unarmed guard named Ray Tyree Singleton, and an inmate named George Baker. 6 prisoners were convicted of murdering Singleton. Because the jury recommended mercy for all of them, the sentences were life imprisonment rather than death. Prosecutors then tried all 6 for the murder of Baker. All 6 were sentenced to death. 5 were hanged in January 1930. Governor James Rolfe commuted the 6th sentence to life in 1931 without public explanation. The 1937 riot ended the era of executions at Folsom and claimed a warden's life. On September 19th, approximately 40 inmates were waiting in a yard to discuss parole hearings with Warden Clarence Larkin. 7 of them attacked him. Larkin was stabbed and dragged toward the prison interior. Officer Harry Martin was stabbed to death at the scene. Larkin died of his wounds 5 days later. A wooden pistol had been carved by hand to look like a semi-automatic weapon and was found among the attackers' equipment. 2 of the 7 were killed by guards during the incident. The remaining 5 were sentenced to death. California outlawed hanging in 1937 and adopted the gas chamber. Robert Lee Cannon and Albert Kessel, 2 of the 5, were among the first people executed in San Quentin's new gas chamber on December 2, 1938. They spent their last night playing records and shouting to each other through the walls of adjacent death cells. 10 minutes before the scheduled time, they shared a cigar and a shot of whiskey. Kessel walked in, was strapped down, and looked at the 40 witnesses watching from behind the glass. "Quite a congregation here," he said quietly. After 1937, the gallows at Folsom were dismantled. The execution chamber was repurposed. The prison kept running. A new generation of California criminals arrived through the 1940s and 1950s, men whose lives had been shaped by the Depression and the post-war dislocation of California's working poor. Folsom, in those years, was receiving the men the state classified as most dangerous, most resistant to management at other facilities, most likely to cause serious harm if placed somewhere less secure. Actor Danny Trejo, who served time at Folsom in the 1960s for robbery, later described the experience as attending a gladiator school. What he meant was that the institution operated on a logic of violence that had nothing to do with rehabilitation and everything to do with survival, alliance, reputation, the willingness to act when the situation required it. This was not a pathology introduced by the prisoners. It was the predictable result of taking large numbers of men with long sentences and histories of institutional violence, housing them in conditions that generated constant low-level friction, providing them with minimal programming, and calling the resulting environment a correctional facility. Timothy Leary passed through Folsom. Eldridge Cleaver served time there before writing Soul on Ice and helping found the Black Panther Party. Charles Manson was held at Folsom. Eric Menendez, convicted in 1996 of murdering his parents with his brother Lyle, is among the institution's current long-term residents. The list of notable names serves a function in the public imagination that is largely disconnected from what Folsom actually was for most of its population. An institution where hundreds of thousands of men served time in cells not meaningfully different from those occupied in 1880, working in a license plate factory that has been running continuously since 1947, in a building whose walls they or their predecessors cut from the hillside with their own hands. The license plates are worth dwelling on for a moment. Since 1947, every vehicle registration plate in California has been manufactured at Folsom State Prison. The factory produces approximately 50,000 plates per day. The inmates who make them are paid between 8 cents and $1 per hour, depending on their assignment and classification level. Every car registered in California carries something made in that building, by those men, at those wages. The arrangement is entirely legal. It has never been seriously challenged in any legislative session. The plates are on the cars. The cars are on the roads that were paved with gravel from the Folsom Quarry. The state capitol sits on a foundation of Folsom granite. The infrastructure of California's public life has been materially supported by the labor of the men locked inside these walls for 145 years, and this fact occupies perhaps a paragraph in the official history. It was into this institution, with all of this history behind it, that a minister named Floyd Gressett brought a tape recording on the evening of January 12, 1968. Gressett ran a church in Ventura, California, where Johnny Cash occasionally attended services, and he also worked as a chaplain at Folsom. Cash was in Sacramento rehearsing in a room at the El Rancho Motel with his band, June Carter, Carl Perkins, the Tennessee Three, preparing for a performance at the prison the next morning. His career had been in serious trouble for several years. His dependence on prescription pills had made him unreliable, his record sales had declined, and Columbia Records had so little confidence in the project they were about to record that they devoted minimal promotional resources to it. Cash himself was sober, recently committed to turning things around, and convinced that performing at Folsom was worth doing on its own terms regardless of the commercial outcome. Cash had written about Folsom since 1953, when he was stationed in Germany with the Air Force and watched a 1951 film called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison. The film gave him a picture of what prison life looked like, and he wrote a song from the point of view of a man inside, watching trains roll past through the bars of his cell. For the lyric that would become the song's most famous line, Cash later explained that he wanted to imagine the worst possible reason a man could kill someone. "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." The line was not autobiographical. Cash had spent a few nights in local jails over the years for minor drug-related incidents, but he had never served a real sentence anywhere. Columbia Records, when the album became a success, did not rush to clarify this distinction. The myth that Cash had done hard time followed him for decades, and the label's advertising copy was written in a way that encouraged rather than corrected it. When Gressett arrived at the motel that evening, he was carrying a tape of a song written by a Folsom inmate named Glenn Shirley. Shirley had been born in Oklahoma in 1936, the son of migrant farm workers who came to California with the Dust Bowl migrations of the 1940s. His criminal record was long and, in its early chapters, almost comical in its smallness. He once robbed an ice cream company of $28 at gunpoint using a toy gun. By the time Cash arrived at Folsom in January 1968, Shirley was serving time for armed robbery and had been in and out of San Quentin, Chino, Soledad, and Folsom across the preceding decade. He had also, inside the prison, written a song. The circumstances of how the song reached Cash are documented in enough detail to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. Shirley was friendly with a man named Earl Green, who ran the prison's radio station and was himself serving time for murder. Green was a Cash fan and encouraged Shirley to write something in Cash's style. Shirley wrote about the prison's chapel, a small granite building within the walls where services were held. He called the song Greystone Chapel. Green recorded it, apparently without Shirley's knowledge, and the recording made its way to Gressett. Gressett brought it to the motel. A young reporter named Jean Belay, covering the event for the Ventura Star Free Press, was in the room when Gressett played the tape. When Cash heard it and asked if anyone had a recorder, Belay raised his hand. Cash listened to the tape a second time while copying down the lyrics. He stayed up working through the song. The following morning, he added it to the set list for the show. Cash later acknowledged that he had learned it the night before and had only run through it once with the band. This would be audible in the recording if you knew to listen for it, which almost no one does because the performance sounds entirely assured. The concert on January 13th, 1968, was held in the prison cafeteria, referred to in some documents as Mess Hall Number 2. The entire prisoner population sat in rows on benches. Guards lined the walls. Armed officers watched from elevated positions. The warden had prohibited standing during the performance. Cash walked out dressed in black. The room erupted before he said a word. His opening line, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," was delivered into applause that the recording captures as something approaching chaos. He ran through a set that included Folsom Prison Blues, I Walk the Line, Cocaine Blues, 25 Minutes to Go, Dark as a Dungeon, Give My Love to Rose, and Jackson with June Carter. He performed 2 complete shows. Producer Bob Johnston recorded both and selected the best material from each for the final album. When Cash announced the final song of each show, this song was written by a man right here in Folsom Prison. He looked directly at Shirley in the front row and told him he hoped the band did the song justice. Shirley had no idea his song was on the set list. Cash had arranged with Gressett to have him seated in the front row, but Shirley did not know why. When Cash announced Greystone Chapel and named its author, pointing at him directly, 800 men erupted in a noise that the recording preserves exactly as it happened. Shirley, a cigarette in his hand, was described by eyewitnesses as going completely still for a moment before being swept into the response around him. Cash later said it was probably a terrible thing to single out a man in a room full of prisoners that way. He did it at both shows. At Folsom Prison was released by Columbia Records on May 6, 1968. The single, a live recording of Folsom Prison Blues, entered the Billboard Hot 100 on May 25th. On June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. Within days, radio stations began pulling the single because of the lyric about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die. Columbia demanded that producer Johnston remix the single with the line removed. Cash protested. The edited version was released. It reached #1 on the Hot Country Singles chart. The album reached #1 on the country charts and #13 on the pop charts. By August, it had shipped more than 300,000 copies. In October, it was certified gold. It eventually went triple platinum, won 2 Grammy Awards, and was added to the Library of Congress National Recording Registry in 2003. Rolling Stone, Time, and Country Music Television have all named it one of the greatest albums ever made. The Library of Congress citation describes it as a document whose social justice themes intersected with the spirit of 1968 in a way that placed it alongside other cultural events of that year that confronted Americans with what they preferred not to see. What the album did for Cash commercially was transformative. He went from playing county fairs to Madison Square Garden and the Los Angeles Forum within 2 years. ABC gave him a weekly television variety show. The success of At Folsom Prison opened international markets for country music that had not previously existed. A follow-up album recorded at San Quentin in 1969 repeated the success. By 1970, Cash was one of the most famous musicians in the world, and his identity had become inseparable from the image of the man in black who stood up for the forgotten. What the album did for the men it depicted is a more complicated accounting. The morning after the concert, they went back to their cells. The license plate factory opened at the usual hour. The conditions that produced the 1927 riot, the 1937 riot, and every smaller act of institutional violence in between were structurally unchanged. The album was a document of a single evening. The prison was an ongoing institution. Glenn Shirley's parole came in March 1971. Cash was at the gate to meet him. He brought Shirley to Nashville, signed him to his publishing company, gave him a touring spot on his roadshow, and introduced him to a woman named Nikki Robbins, who worked at House of Cash. They married at Cash's home in Tennessee, with Cash as best man. Cash arranged to have Shirley's 2 children from a previous relationship flown in for the wedding. Shirley's album, recorded at Vacaville Prison before his release, climbed to number 63 on the Billboard country charts. Country singer Eddie Arnold recorded one of his other songs. Cash promoted him on television. For roughly a year and a half, the story looked exactly like what Cash believed it was. Proof that redemption was available to anyone. That the right combination of talent and genuine human support could bring a man back from whatever Folsom represented. The collapse was gradual and then sudden. Shirley struggled to adapt to the rhythms of touring life after years of institutional routine. He was unreliable with scheduling. His drug use and drinking, which had been part of his life before prison and which prison had not treated, resumed. Marshall Grant, Cash's bassist and road manager since 1954, confronted Shirley about missed call times and flights. Shirley's response, which Grant later recounted in detail to Rolling Stone, was to describe, in a quiet and entirely specific way, what he would like to do to Grant with a butcher knife. He said he loved Grant like a brother. He said he wanted to drain every drop of blood from his body onto the floor. He was smoking a cigarette while he said it. Grant went to Cash and June Carter and told them it was over. Cash made the decision to end the arrangement. After being dismissed from the touring show, Shirley lost his footing in Nashville quickly. He became estranged from his wife and children. He found work on a cattle farm in California, feeding 10,000 animals a day, and lived in the cab of a semi-truck. His drinking escalated. His drug use went out of control. In May 1978, while under the influence of drugs, he shot a man. 2 days later, on May 11th, hiding in his brother's house in Gonzales, California, he shot himself. He was 42 years old. Cash paid for the funeral. Cash's daughter, Tara Cash, Schwiebel, later said she believed her father felt he had given Shirley a genuine chance at life and had done what he could. Marshall Grant's summary was more direct. It's just over. After Shirley's death, Cash ended his advocacy for prison reform and stopped performing in prisons. He had testified before a Senate subcommittee on the subject in 1972 and met with President Nixon, calling for rehabilitation over punishment and for keeping juveniles out of the adult prison system. The senators had listened. Nixon had shaken his hand. The percentage of Californians in state prisons has nearly doubled since the Folsom concert. The United States now incarcerates more than 2 million people, a figure that was around 200,000 in 1968. Cash's advocacy was sincere and well-argued and largely without measurable legislative result, which is not a reflection on Cash. Folsom in the 1970s and 1980s was characterized by gang violence severe enough that the California Department of Corrections eventually developed secure housing units at other locations, specifically to remove the most dangerous prisoners from the general population. Folsom was reclassified as a medium security facility during this period. Its formal status as an end-of-the-line institution technically passed to other California prisons. The walls remained, the cell blocks remained. The cafeteria where Cash had played remained. The granite chapel where Shirley had written his song remained and continued to hold services, and the mural of the Last Supper painted by prisoners remained on its walls, the faces reportedly bearing some resemblance to inmates who were present when it was made, though the records on this are incomplete. In 1987, an inmate named Glenn Stewart Godwin demonstrated that the 30-foot wall and its 15-foot underground extension were not, in fact, absolute. Godwin was serving time for murder and had already escaped once from a lower security facility, which was why he had been moved to Folsom. Authorities later concluded that his wife and a former cellmate had smuggled a hacksaw and other tools inside. On June 5th, Godwin cut through fence wire, dropped into a storm drain, and crawled 750 feet through complete darkness until the drain emptied into the American River. A raft had been left at the riverbank. Painted arrows on rocks showed him which direction to float. He paddled away. He was arrested in Mexico in 1991 and escaped from a prison in Guadalajara later that year. As of this writing, he remains on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He is one of the very few people to have escaped from Folsom State Prison and not been returned. By 2009, Folsom held 4,427 prisoners against a design capacity that had been set at approximately 1,800 in 1880 and officially expanded to around 2,469 in the intervening century. The overcrowding was not exceptional by California standards. The state's entire prison system had been operating well above capacity for years, a consequence of mandatory minimum sentencing laws, the expansion of drug offenses as prosecutable crimes, and what penologists had begun calling mass incarceration. The costs of housing prisoners had become significant enough that state budgets were visibly strained. The recidivism rate, the percentage of released prisoners who returned to prison within 3 years, was higher than it had been in 1968. NPR journalist Laura Sullivan, reporting around 2009, noted that in 1968 most of the Folsom prisoners who attended Cash's concert and were subsequently released did not return to prison. In 2009, most of those who were released did return. The difference between those two statistics represents decades of policy decisions about sentencing, rehabilitation, funding, and what prisons are actually supposed to accomplish. The Folsom Prison Museum, housed in a building that predates the prison itself, constructed in the 1870s by the Natoma Water and Mining Company and used for prison staff housing until 1982, when the last family to live on prison grounds moved out, receives regular visitors who come to see the cell blocks, the execution history, the artifacts, and the photographs. The gift shop is well stocked. Near the prison, a bridge over the American River has been informally named for Cash, though this is not an official designation. In the cafeteria where Cash performed in 1968, a prison music program continues to operate. A guitarist named Andrew Clayton plays in a band called Blind Justice. He has said that he does not particularly like country music, but that Cash's connection to this specific place means something to him. The programs that allow Blind Justice to exist are the kinds of programs Cash testified in favor of in 1972 before the Senate subcommittee. The senators who heard that testimony have been out of office for decades. The programs are smaller than what Cash was asking for. The prison is still open. The license plate factory is still running. Unit 1 of the main cell block, with a capacity of nearly 1,200 inmates on 4 5-tiered sections, is the most populous single cell block in the United States. The cells are larger than the originals, 8 by 10 feet instead of 4 by 8, and they have toilets and sinks, which the 1880 cells did not. The air holes were added in the 1940s. Progress has been made. The cemetery above Folsom Dam holds the bodies of inmates who died in custody with no family to claim them, or whose families could not afford transport. Graves are marked with numbered plaques. Names are recorded in departmental files, available to researchers who know to request them. George Baker, the inmate killed in the 1927 Thanksgiving riot, is buried there. Some of the men who died on the gallows between 1895 and 1937 are buried there. The hillside is visible from the road. It is not marked with any sign. The story that Folsom State Prison tells about itself, through its museum, through the Cash mythology, through the films shot on location, through the gift shop items, is a story about an institution with a dramatic past that has evolved into something more measured and modern. That story is not false. It is selective. The things it selects against are not obscure. They are in the state archives, in the official reports of the State Board of Charities and Corrections, in the records of every legislative hearing about prison conditions that California has conducted since 1880. The conditions in those records are often worse than the public version of the story suggests, and the gap between the two is not accidental. Institutions are good at managing their own narratives. Folsom has had 145 years of practice. What Cash did on January 13, 1968, was to stand in the middle of that institution and address, directly and without condescension, the men it contained. He did not sing about prisoners. He sang to them in their space with their responses audible on the recording. The rawness of that transaction, the complete absence of performance for a general audience, the way the inmates reacted, with the uncensored honesty of people who had nothing to lose by reacting honestly, was what made the album transcend its genre and its moment. It still does. The recording is as alive now as it was in 1968, which is the thing about great documents. They carry the temperature of the room where they were made. The room still exists. The walls are the same granite, cut by the hands of men who could not leave. The chapel where Shirley wrote his song still holds services on Sunday mornings. The prisoners who walk to it cross a yard ringed by the same gun towers that were there when Cash performed. Outside the walls, the bridge over the American River bears an informal name that keeps one specific evening in public memory, while the 145 years surrounding it recede into the administrative record. The 44 men who stepped off the train on July 26, 1880, have no monument. What they have is what the prison kept: a count, a charge, a sentence length, and the products of their labor, which are in the roads and the buildings and on the cars of the state that sent them there, and which will outlast every name in every ledger by centuries.